When historians look back at New York in 1835, their attention naturally fixes on the disaster above ground. The massive fire that destroyed Lower Manhattan. The 700 buildings lost in a single December night. The financial district turned to frozen ash. The city's core gutted in temperatures so extreme that water froze before it could reach the flames. But the true story, the one missing from newspaper reports and still buried in archival darkness, began beneath the streets. It started with a simple debris clearance operation. Engineers were told to dig out the burned district, stabilize foundations across 17 blocks, and assess whether the scorched ground could support a rebuilt commercial hub. While the nation watched New York's merchants salvage what remained of America's financial capital, the goal was purely practicable: clear the rubble, inspect the ground, and prepare for rebuilding. But the moment workers started breaking through the charred basements, something entirely unexpected happened. They broke into spaces that had been sealed for generations. Below the merchant buildings, at depths far beyond any recorded cellar, the teams discovered rooms and machinery that matched no building records. Their layout was confusing. Their purpose was impossible to explain, and the equipment looked like nothing found in the mechanical encyclopedias of the time. It didn't even resemble British industrial engineering, as normally understood. This information never appeared in public reconstruction reports. It never showed up in newspapers covering New York's remarkable comeback. Yet in the confidential documents from that period, a certain phrase appears again and again: unexpected machinery, unexplainable depth, unknown origin. The official explanation would later dismiss all of this as old pumping gear, abandoned workshop tools, or simply misidentified fire rubble. Nothing special, nothing worth looking into. But the salvage photographs from that winter, the ones developed in dark rooms while New York rebuilt at astonishing speed, tell a different story. They show workers standing next to metal casings cut with precision far beyond any foundry of that era's capability. Assemblies fitted so perfectly that even with the poor lighting of 1835 photography, no seams are visible. Machines and turbines that look nothing like any known American manufacturer, but instead appear older, more complex, more deliberate. And the deeper they dug, the less the layers resembled our normal understanding of industrial history, and the more they looked like technology that had been buried, hidden, and purposely erased from memory. At first, the recovery crews tried to categorize everything in the simplest possible way: obsolete hydraulic equipment, abandoned factory leftovers from before the fire. But as records grew and more machinery was uncovered, the contradictions multiplied. Why were some mechanisms built to standards far stricter than any factory of the time could achieve? Why were certain parts made in uniform designs, as if mass-produced rather than hand-forged? Why did some systems extend into spaces far beyond the boundaries of any recorded building? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers: why were these machines so strikingly advanced? New York in 1835 was industrializing quickly. Yet the machinery under parts of the burned district seemed designed for purposes no contemporary engineer could name. Recovery teams quietly admitted among themselves that the sophistication and accuracy didn't match any known maker. And although none of them used terms like a lost technology, they recognized something just as unsettling: someone had built these machines before. Not simple tools, not basic engines, power generation systems. As the records grew, so did the silence. Reports became shorter. Descriptions grew vaguer. Photographs stopped showing the most complete views of the finds. And then, in early 1836, the excavation areas were partially refilled, covered where new foundations required it, and much of what had been uncovered was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain: documents, a handful of photos, and the quiet accounts of archivists who studied the files before some vanished entirely. But even from what survives, a pattern emerges. Machinery too precise for any known maker. Components too advanced for the accepted timeline. Engineering methods that seem inherited rather than invented. Technology that appears to belong to an entirely different age of construction. And this is where modern researchers begin asking questions the 1835 teams could barely put into words. Was New York built above a forgotten power facility? Were earlier engineers reusing machinery they didn't truly understand? And why did so much of the recovery stay undocumented, sealed up, or simply erased from the records? When the recovery teams moved past the first recognizable layers, beneath the burned district, their expectations were basic. They thought they would find cellar levels, maybe some old utility lines, and scattered remains from before the fire. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks, that assumption shattered. Instead of an orderly stack of basement floors, the teams uncovered a series of technological layers that didn't behave like a normal city's infrastructure should. The first oddity was interconnection. Every layer, known basement, unknown sub-basements, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same energy distribution systems, the same conduit layouts, the same engineering logic. Different eras shouldn't show that. Different builders, different purposes, different decades. They don't build in perfect harmony with systems from generations earlier. Yet beneath New York, they did. Conduits from one period connected directly to conduits buried meters below them. Energy networks kept the same paths, even when separated by what looked like entire building cycles. It was as if every group that ever built on this land was tapping into an original infrastructure, one that no longer existed in any engineering archive. As the workers dug deeper, the layers grew stranger. Below the expected basements and foundations, they began finding machinery that looked nothing like contemporary equipment. Much larger housings, much tighter tolerances, designs that seemed too mathematically perfect for anything in New York's recorded history. Some mechanisms appeared almost overbuilt, rotating parts in perfect balance, crafted with a precision that didn't match the crude factories of the era. And then came the discovery that baffled even the most cautious members of the engineering team's crystalline chambers. Not ordinary storage rooms or utility spaces, but geometric rooms lined with materials that seemed to conduct energy. Metal surfaces showing signs of long-term electromagnetic activity. Lower rooms with what appeared to be resonance amplification systems. Housings containing crystal formations that only make sense for machinery generating power through means other than steam or water. Yet no historical record shows New York ever possessing such power generation before the fire. No documents describe industrial processes requiring this kind of energy management. Nothing explains why large sections of the deepest infrastructure look as though they once housed technology far beyond any recognized power system of the early 19th century. Recovery photographs from 1835 and 1836 show this clearly. Workers standing next to housings so massive that the men look tiny beside them. Components machined so precisely that even today, electrical engineers study the archive images in disbelief. Tolerances and assemblies that resemble modern power generation far more than anything 1830s America is credited with. But the most troubling detail wasn't what appeared in the photos. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports, written in the months after the fire, barely mention these features. Some drawings leave out the deepest chambers entirely. Certain machinery is vaguely labeled as debris or earlier equipment. even though the photos show it was far more complex than that. The silence is hard to ignore, because if these deeper finds truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual mechanisms fully documented? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections? Instead of gathered into a single city report, even some of the components raised red flags. Edges too sharp, surfaces too smooth, channels too uniform. Marks that looked less like hand forging and more like precision machining. Machining that, according to the standard timeline, didn't exist when those parts were supposedly made. The deeper the teams dug, the harder it became to fit these findings into the neat, linear story of New York's past, because layer by layer, the ground under the financial district began to look less like a sequence of construction phases and more like a repository of buried secrets. A place built, rebuilt, and buried multiple times, yet always connected to the same mysterious infrastructure. And this brings us to the most important turning point in the entire discovery. Infrastructure that didn't belong to any period, a system that matched neither American engineering nor European design, nor any known civilization. Something out of place, something anachronistic. When the recovery teams pressed deeper into the ground beneath the burned district, the finds stopped resembling anything from an orderly industrial timeline. What they began uncovering were systems that didn't fit American engineering, didn't fit European design, and didn't even fit each other in any normal sense. Instead, they formed a strange technological language, one that seemed to come from multiple eras, yet somehow remained unified, integrated, and impossibly precise. The first shock came with the chambers themselves. These weren't crude storage basements or narrow utility passages. They were geometrically perfect spaces. Rooms shaped to exact dimensions, archways holding their curves flawlessly. Metal frameworks arranged with a coherence like the remains of a master facility, no longer found in any archive. Some chambers were completely sealed, packed so tight with fill that workers thought they'd hit bedrock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked undisturbed since the moment they were closed. Finished walls, fitted metal, and machinery that raised more questions than answers. Then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the spherical power cores. Officially, they were later labeled as old system equipment or abandoned boiler parts. But nothing about them matches typical water storage or steam generation. They were too symmetrical, too precisely machined, too perfectly sealed, as if designed with tools capable of holding tolerances we associate with modern manufacturing. Some cores were large enough for several men to stand inside. Others contained internal mechanisms that seemed built for spinning at enormous speeds. Workers from 1835 described them in private letters as engineered vessels. Not storage tanks, but containers with an energetic purpose, though no one could say what that purpose was. The surfaces of these spheres showed odd features: crystalline patterns embedded in the metal, geometric engravings that seemed to channel energy, and materials that 1830s metallurgists couldn't identify. Another anomaly appeared in the power distribution networks themselves. These weren't just wires or pipes lying on chamber floors. Many were built into the walls, set at angles that made no conventional sense, embedded in stonework that clearly predated any electrical system New York officially had. They were made with guide channels, conduits that made no sense for steam or hydraulic power, but perfect sense for something conducting energy through resonance or electromagnetic principles. It raised an uncomfortable possibility. The buildings above ground might not simply rest on natural foundations. They might sit on something far larger. A power generation system whose function was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the city's official history. The further the workers explored, the stranger the finds became. Metal parts appeared with perfectly straight edges. Some surfaces were polished smooth, almost mirror-like. Others showed precision, cut lines so clean that modern machinists still debate what tools could have made them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the material composition of certain components. Some pieces were made from alloys that 1835 metallurgists couldn't identify. Others displayed crystalline structures that only form under conditions far beyond any forge or foundry of that era. Certain materials seemed to react to magnetic fields in ways that shouldn't be possible with known metals of the time. The later official explanation, unusual ore deposits, meteoric iron, natural mineral formations, doesn't explain why these materials appear in machined components, not raw form. Shaped, processed, manufactured into precise mechanical parts. That kind of metallurgy requires temperatures and techniques far beyond 19th century capability, far beyond anything documented in American industrial history. Some surfaces showed what modern engineers would recognize as electromagnetic scoring patterns, marks that only form when high-frequency energy passes through conductive materials, repeatedly over long periods. Shortly after these discoveries, something odd began to happen. Chambers were refilled. Passages were blocked. Deep sections of the recovery zone were closed off from further digging. Some of this was officially called safety measures, necessary to support new construction above. But the decisions about which chambers to fill first and which areas to permanently bury raised quiet questions among observers, because the spaces sealed immediately were consistently the ones containing the most anomalous machinery. The precision cores, the unknown alloy components, the integrated energy systems, the crystalline chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the excavation zone. These chambers were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random basement spaces. They were part of an organized layout, a grid of rooms that looked less like storage and more like nodes in a power network. Aligned, measured, planned, as if they once served a function we can no longer identify. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from later maps. When you examine the final weeks of the 1835 recovery operation, something becomes impossible to overlook. The project didn't conclude. It was stopped, not finished, not completed, halted. The deeper the recovery teams went, the more the tone of their records changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language grows cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else had suddenly taken control of what could be written down. And this is where the ultimate mystery begins, because the final chambers they opened beneath New York weren't ordinary. They weren't basements. They weren't utility spaces. They weren't even identifiable as any known type of infrastructure. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described machinery that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the inexplicable. Housings with tolerances, so tight you couldn't slip paper between the parts. Rotating assemblies balanced with precision that 1830s America was never supposed to have. Platforms built to support mechanisms far heavier than anything documented in the structures above. And passages that extended beyond the excavation zone, vanishing into darkness beneath modern New York. But here's the part that always gets hidden. The most advanced machinery was the equipment that got buried the fastest. Workers described filling entire chambers back in, sealing entrances, packing earth into spaces just uncovered. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. The official explanation: structural concerns, safety requirements, construction deadlines. But if it was only about safety, why was the most sophisticated, most precisely engineered equipment sealed first? And why was the obviously damaged debris left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make logical sense unless those deeper finds posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, but a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath New York truly showed engineering far beyond 1830s capability, and if some of that machinery didn't match any known manufacturer at all, then the entire accepted story of American technological development begins to fall apart. Imagine what it would mean if a modern city was built on top of something far more ancient, something advanced, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the foundations weren't merely basements, but deliberate attempts by later builders to hide or repurpose technology they couldn't explain. And perhaps that is why the 1835 discoveries were quietly reburied, not to protect the sites, but to protect the story. The surviving photographs tell their own tale. Workers standing next to housings that look almost modern. Components that resemble precision manufacturing systems, too integrated for their supposed age. These aren't the kinds of finds historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the final question. One no archive, no textbook, no official publication has ever fully answered. Why was the most advanced evidence, the most sophisticated machinery, the most anomalous technology sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The precision machinery was buried. The unknown alloys were buried. The integrated energy systems were buried. The crystalline chambers were buried. The spherical power cores were buried. And even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the recovery operation had accidentally uncovered a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the Great Fire, older than the city we know, older than the story we were given. And for one brief moment in 1835, the ground opened just enough to reveal it. But instead of investigating, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if New York stands on top of technology built by a civilization we no longer recognize, then the real question isn't what was found in 1835. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other fires? What other disasters? What other convenient destructions cleared the surface just long enough for someone to bury what existed below? The 1835 etheric power plants weren't just debris from a forgotten factory. They were a glimpse, a brief, accidental glimpse, into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how our world was really built. Because if this survived under one city, imagine what still hums in the darkness beneath the rest. Something misplaced. Something anachronistic. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are plenty more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.